Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History. This is our continuing series on the Traditionalist movement, 1964 to the present. And this is episode 3, which I'm calling Rebel Priests, 1964 to 1978. Last episode, we dealt with the early lay movement for trying to retain the old Roman liturgy in the Catholic Church, and the Traditionalist movement, that aspect. This time we're going to be talking about the clerical opposition to the change in the liturgy and other changes after Vatican II. And what we're getting at here is a little different, because we have to talk about the dynamics of this is a little different between laymen and clergy, which one of the reasons I split this up into 2 episodes. Laymen aren't bound by the same level of obedience, of course, to bishops, although we all are, of course. And, of course, things change if we left off last time talking about when the official implementation of the new Mass took effect in the early 1970s. And what happens is, as you're going to see, we mentioned last time, Paul VI issued this apostolic constitution. He clearly intended the new Mass to become the norm for the Church. And by 1976 or so, there's an official line coming from most bishops' conferences, most bishops from the Vatican. And it's basically that the old Mass is done. Yeah, it's been done away with. It's over with. And I say official line because this type of statement comes not from the Pope himself, but through other authorities, usually speaking in his name, or trying to speak in his name, or in the name of the Second Vatican Council. For example, and to give you an idea of just how open they are, by the way, about what a break this is with the past. In 1976, one of these liturgical reformers, a man named Joseph Gelanu, if you've been a cantor before at your parish, if you go to a Novus Ordo parish, you may recognize that name. He wrote a series of psalm tones for the new liturgy. And he had no doubts about what had happened with the coming of the new missal. This is a quote from a book he wrote in 1976, The Liturgy Today and Tomorrow. Make no mistake about it. To translate is not to say the same thing with other words. It is to change the form. If the form changes, the rite changes. It must be said, without mincing words, the Roman rite, as we know it, no longer exists. As we knew it, no longer exists. It has been destroyed. And he goes on to say it would not be right to identify this liturgical renewal with the reform of rites decided on by Vatican II, unquote. In other words, this was a break with the past in Gelanu's mind. And so this is the official line of the liturgical establishment, we want to call it, like people like Gelanu. But also more formal authorities around the Vatican. In 1975, the L'Osservatore Romano, the official newspaper of the Vatican, issued a statement, had an article about the liturgy, which chastised traditionalists who were in Rome that year going on a pilgrimage, and lamented their refusal to, quote, fall into line with present dispositions in the Church, unquote. The same thing with people in the Vatican itself, the Congregation for Divine Worship, and Balbonini complained about in his memoirs those who, quote, had difficulty coming to grips with the new order of things, unquote. And here everyone thought that, the Second Vatican Council had been a pastoral council. And you had people talking like it had been some sort of revolution or something. And in fact, Vatican officials despised traditionalists. They saw them all as people acting in bad faith. They didn't really care about the liturgy. They just hated them, hated authority, hated the Second Vatican Council. They wanted to undermine the Pope's authority. And they conflated all of them together with the most extreme traditionalists who said things like the new Mass was Protestant, that it was heretical, that it was invalid. And yes, some were saying all three, and all three of these things are wrong. But they didn't make any distinctions. They just sort of swept them all under the rug. But the key thing to note here is that no papal or Vatican statement ever gave a theological rationale for the suppression of the old missal. As opposed to, by the way, progressive theologians and liturgists who like running their mouths, but not any official statements. And I should mention that this line of argumentation about the liturgy is propagated to this day by professional liturgists in, official, theology departments, Catholic universities, different, liturgical commissions in the Vatican or in bishops' conferences or in diocesan institutions. And these people defend the new rite and the suppression of the old one, both for ideological or theological reasons, but also practical reasons, because almost all of these institutions were created as a result of having to implement the new liturgy. In other words, not only do they have, ideological reasons for wanting to get rid of the old rite, they also would be out of a job if it wasn't for the creation of a new liturgy in the first place. So they're doubly invested in this stuff. Moreover, what I'm calling this official line, official in the sense that you have officials using it. It's not necessarily what the church teaches. They're not identical. This official line also equated, and still does in many ways, opposition to the new Mass or opposition to the suppression of the old one with opposition to the council, which is a claim that does not hold up to scrutiny. Sanctum Concilium, the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, issued by the Second Vatican Council, says in its fourth paragraph, and I quote here, quote, "In faithful obedience to tradition, the Sacred Council declares that Holy Mother Church holds all lawfully acknowledged rites to be of equal right and dignity, that she wishes to preserve them in the future and to foster them in every way. The Council also desires that, where necessary, the rites be revised carefully in the light of sound tradition," unquote. Nothing about suppressing the old Roman Missal in that. Quite the opposite. It says to be preserved. The Council Fathers celebrated Mass according to the old Roman Missal all throughout the Council. They simply did not envision getting rid of it. And yes, of course, we'll come to this in the course of this and future episodes. Yes, there are other things besides the liturgy. The traditionalists have theological issues with the Second Vatican Council to a certain degree. Depends on which traditionalist you're talking about. We'll get to that, but that's a different matter, a little more difficult. There really is no debate about this in the liturgy. And so one of the things I want to emphasize here is that there's actually a lot of confusion in the 1970s and even today about what Paul VI did when he issued his apostolic constitution, creating the new Mass. Because it clearly stated that he wanted to become the new norm for the church. But it just doesn't say anything about suppressing the old one. The only people who do that are individual bishops and bishops' conferences. And in fact, the only official notice that the old Mass was to be suppressed came from the Vatican, from two notes issued by the Congregation for Divine Worship in 1971 and 1974 in its magazine called Notitiae, stating that the old Mass can no longer be celebrated except by old priests without congregations. However, to abrogate a liturgy as old as the old rite is, that most people agree that has to come from the Pope himself. And in fact, the Congregation for Divine Worship toyed with getting a definitive ruling from the Pontifical Commission on the Interpretation of Legislative Texts, which is a body that rules on stuff in the Vatican. But it refrained from doing so. And it did so because, according to Annibale Bonini in his memoirs of the liturgical reform, that they were afraid of being seen as, quote, casting odium on the liturgical tradition, unquote. Which is revealing because, if you're going to destroy something and get rid of it, that does kind of mean you're casting odium on it, doesn't it? And as far as I can tell, besides all this, Paul VI never issued any further clarification as to why the old Mass needed to go. He just said it needed to go and you should obey, that's it. And there's good reason for this. Excuse me. Because the only reason I can think of to justify getting rid of the old rite is this. you'd have to say that there was something fundamentally wrong with the old liturgy in theological terms, that somehow it expressed some sort of theological error about the faith. But doing this would be effectively saying that the church's worship had been corrupted, fundamentally corrupted, for centuries on end. And this would basically mean effectively denying the church's indefectibility. If you don't know what indefectibility means, it means that Holy Spirit abandoned the church to error in its worship. In other words, this isn't a Catholic critique of the old liturgy, it's a Protestant one, basically. Which, to be sure, many Catholic theologians like to say things like this, but liberal bishops are a lot more careful of coming out and saying this, as was Pope Francis in Traditionalist Custodes. Although his remarks about it fostering division clearly implied there's something wrong with the old rite. But because they don't want to be seen as making a break with the past, they just want to insinuate it. The defenders of this suppression are kind of coy about it to a certain degree and never give reasons. I mention this because as a result of this coyness, but also all the multiple authorities involved in this implementation of the new liturgy, you have a lot of confusion on the ground as to just to what's going on. The Pope's issuing statements, the Concilium's issuing statements, the Congregation of Divine Worship issues statements, the Secretary of State gets involved in this, bishops' conferences issue statements, individual bishops issue statements about this. Adding to this confusion, the Pope, as we've seen in the case of the English indult, or the Agatha Christie indult, issues exceptions to it, exemptions from it, I should say. Not just to England as a whole, but to different bodies. Opus Dei, for example. Jose Maria Escriva got an exemption, as I guess keep saying the old Mass. Certain individual bishops were given exemptions. So again, all this creates confusion about what exactly is going on. Which, of course, is on top of the either refusal to or the inability of the bishops, the Pope, to stop liturgical abuses at the other end of the spectrum, the progressive end of the spectrum, as we've talked about already. Combined with one other big, huge problem, actually. One of the things that they almost immediately did, all these bishop conferences, when they began implementing the new liturgy, they automatically translated these things into the vernacular. They made no attempt to retain Latin as the Second Vatican Council's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy called for. They just translated them all into the vernacular overnight. And what happened was, of course, many of these translations were not very accurate. They did not reflect the original Latin text of the new Missal. And so, in the translation of the original Latin text, excuse me, of the Eucharistic prayer in the new rite, when it's talking about praying for salvation in the Eucharistic prayer, you may have heard this. Remember this, the word pro multis, which means for many. Again, this is the prayer I can't remember off the top of my head. Christ gave his life for him and for many, for you and for many, basically. Which, of course, got translated in the English translation as to for all. Which, of course, could be taken to imply some sort of universal salvation. And this led some people, some traditionalists, to believe that this consecration was heretical and therefore invalid. And again, you don't have to agree with that critique to understand just the sort of distress these sorts of things caused. This wasn't changed, by the way, until 2011. If you're young enough to be listening to this and you don't remember any of this stuff, you'll remember this. You remember how you used to say in the Mass, the Lord be with you and also with you. And now we say, the Lord be with you and with your spirit. That's because it more faithfully reflects the original Latin text of the new Missal. They only changed it in the early 2000s. So that's why you have some of these traditionalists becoming paranoid and saying, attacking the council or attacking the new liturgy. One of the reasons, yes, they shouldn't have done this. It's bad. But I don't think people quite grasp the level of confusion. that's going on. And so it's into this sort of confused gray area legally about the new Mass that you will get a sort of, I'm going to call it a sort of traditionalist underground springing up in places, America, lesser extent Europe. I know more about America. I'm thinking, by the way, as almost like a parallel with the old 1970s radical underground. You know, people who were on the run from the FBI in the 1970s. What happens is, you know, people, priests who don't like the changes will retire, and laity will seek them out. Say, hey, you're retired, you can still say this Mass, technically speaking. They'll go and, you know, they'll have Mass in rented halls, in hotel conference rooms, in basements, in mobile homes, wherever they can find it. And so you'll have people, you know, still saying the Mass in a sort of furtive, clandestine way. You'll even have sort of new communities spring up around this. Well, one of the most intriguing, I'll give you some examples from North America. Most intriguing is a place up in Ottawa, Canada called St. Clements Parish. And St. Clements was actually a parish that got a permission from their bishop in 1968 to continue saying the old Mass, which they did until 1974 when the Vatican ordered them to stop doing it. And so they switched over and started saying the new one in Latin until they switched back when they changed things under John Paul II and Benedict XVI. In Pittsburgh, you had a group of laity who actually created their own little Latin Mass community on the north side of Pittsburgh. They began, you know, rescuing altars. They rescued an altar from out of the trash heap, basically, from where liturgical reformers had thrown it out. Started meeting in their own homes, eventually got retired priests to help them out, started actually raising money, and they, you know, found their own places to worship. They even flew in priests from other part of the Northeast to help them celebrate. In the mid-1960s, they eventually had enough money pooled, had enough people to purchase an old Orthodox church, and they became, they give themselves the name Our Lady of Fatima, and eventually had their own priest during all this period of confusion. It still exists, by the way. Our Lady of Fatima is still in Pittsburgh. In Kentucky, a priest named Francis Hannafin, early 1960s, decided he wanted no part of the reform. He retired with his faculties intact. He bought a piece of land with a mobile home on it, made a chapel out of it, and people started coming. So you get these little sort of Latin Mass communities springing up across the states. And I presume I don't know as much about Europe. It must have happened to a certain extent there as well. And so that's one dynamic. You do have other priests more willing to openly do this. And I'll mention a few of these before we get to the big hitter in all this, which is the SSPX. But actually the first person to really challenge the whole liturgical change was, actually the man who gives a name, I guess, to this opposition to the changes that happened after the council, Traditionalist movement, as a priest named Father Gomar de Pauw. And Gomar de Pauw was Belgian by birth. He was born in Belgium, had ancestors who had fought on the side of the Americans in the American Revolutionary War. In World War II, he served as a chaplain and a medic, was captured at the Battle of Dunkirk, 1942, but escaped, and later on served as chaplain to the armies that liberated Belgium from the Nazis. Eventually, he completed his studies at Louvain before moving to the United States, where he had family, earned a doctorate in canon law from CUA, and from 1962 to 1965, he became the dean of the seminary at Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, Maryland. Beautiful place if you haven't been there. As he became a respected seminary dean and canon law teacher. And what's interesting about him is he was actually tabbed to be a peritus. A peritus is a theological advisor to a bishop. To a bishop, I don't have his full name here, unfortunately, Bishop Kurtz, a German bishop, a German-born bishop, who had been a Franciscan missionary evicted from his missionary diocese in China in 1949 by the Communist Revolution. And so he brought de Pauw with him to the council in 1964, which he was all for. What happened was, as soon as he got brought back home to Maryland, de Pauw apparently reacted really badly against the imposition of vernacular in 1964. Remember, in 1964, you had this preliminary permission given by the Pope to start making changes. And I recall last time we talked just about how it was almost overnight this happened. And what happened is you had these liturgists who'd been waiting for this. They'd actually produced, well before the council had decided on this, their own pamphlets, their own literature, their own booklets for the Mass, anticipating this stuff so they could take advantage of it. And this apparently freaked him out, something fierce. And it led him in December, just a month or so later, to issue a manifesto. Actually, it's a letter he wrote to all the bishops in the Vatican, to the Pope, to all the bishops in the United States, on December 31st, 1964, basically listing a list of grievances regarding the new liturgy. And it claimed a number of things. I won't go through all of this. You can find this stuff on the internet. But it claimed that, these, changes of the Mass were introduced without, as he says, the average Catholic man and woman being consulted. It claims that these liturgical changes were not called for by public opinion, but were, in his words, quote, extorted from our bishops by a small but well-organized minority of self-appointed so-called liturgical experts. And he says quite clearly that they recognize the advantages of some use of the vernacular in the celebration of the Mass, but they also want to retain at the same time the use of Latin. And he's quite clear in this. He makes this clear that he thinks the reforms introduced in 1964 are in defiance of the Second Vatican Council and not in obedience to it. And he actually calls for, among other things in this manifesto, a halt to any further use of the vernacular, to basically, rein in some of the permissiveness that's happened since this is only 1964. That council's still ongoing. And they asked specifically for the old Latin form of Mass to be retained. And what happens is this letter gets leaked to the press in March of 1965. And what's going to happen is the press is going to label him the rebel priest because he's allegedly going against the council, which he was a paratist there. He was a supporter of it. And so he begins to form what he calls the Catholic Traditionalist movement, which is, it's basically just him and a few lay supporters as far as I can tell. But it draws the attention of his cardinal, who in 1965, July of that year, fires him as dean of Mount St. Mary's Seminary and orders him to return to Baltimore as a priest. He was, basically going around trying to defend what he was doing, partly with the help of Cardinal Spellman of New York. In response, Bishop Kurtz, the man he'd acted for as an apparitist at the council, tried to have him incarnated into his Roman diocese as a priest, and then let him reside in New York. But Cardinal Sheehan of Baltimore and his allies in Rome tried to block this for several years. Eventually, he found a chapel in Westbury, New York, and set up shop there, and incorporated the Catholic Traditionalist movement as a nonprofit in 1968. He wrote a defense of his conduct in 1967 called The Rebel Priest, the rebel in quotation marks, because he didn't think he'd been a rebel. This is something he says in that little booklet there, pamphlet, The Rebel Priest, is that I'm doing exactly the same thing I was doing before the council. How is everything I'm doing now wrong? I'm not opposed to vernacular. There's something wrong with it, but we want to retain Latin, just as the Second Vatican Council said it should be retained. And he actually sent a private letter to Paul VI in 1967 as well, begging him to roll back the reforms, but to no avail. But he's an interesting character, Gomar de Pau. And by the way, this still exists. He passed away in 2005. You can still visit the Ave Maria Chapel up at Westbury, New York. And his supporters have a website where this is where I got some of this information from. They're a little protective of his legacy, to say the least. But he deserves credit. He's the first person to notice that something went wrong with this whole reform right away. And a lot of the criticisms he makes in his little manifesto and his little pamphlet, they hold up pretty well. He has a lot of good points to make, a lot of points that will be reiterated by traditionalists later on. He deserves a little more credit among traditionalists, I think, for what he did, although he didn't seem to have that much influence outside of that initial burst of attention he got. But he was left alone, as were some of these. You also have a second group being founded in the early 1970s, slightly different, called the Orthodox Roman Catholic movement. And this was founded by a couple of men, a couple of priests. One, Francis Fenton, the one Richard McKenna, who was a Dominican. And this is a little different here, partly because of who Francis Fenton was. He was a priest in Connecticut, and lay Catholics approached him in 1970 about saying the Old Mass, and he eventually gathered several other like-minded priests around him who started saying Masses in Connecticut and then elsewhere. In addition to giving lectures on the present, what they called crisis in the church. And so by 1975, 7 priests said Masses, along with Fenton, in this group they formed, despite severe criticism. And in fact, he remained a good priest in good standing, as far as I'm aware, to the end of his days. Partly because, as one bishop explained in a newspaper article in 1977, they didn't want to give him too much attention. So I guess they were too small to matter. But by 1979, this Orthodox Roman Catholic movement was holding occasional Masses in 18 cities in 12 states across the United States, as well as 8 regular Sunday Masses in 6 states, conducted by 11 priests. So you do have this sort of circuit of underground Masses going on. And I mentioned why this is a little different. We'll see next time, we'll go into more detail. But Francis Fenton was a little more political than pretty much every figure I'm going to talk about here. He was a member in the 1960s and 70s of the John Birch Society. If you don't know what this is a really radical, anti-communist, right-wing society in the 1960s and 70s, which, opposed things like the civil rights movement. So he was controversial for that reason as well. I'll talk more about him as we go forward, because they'll have something to do with some of the antics of the Traditionalist movement in the early and late 70s. But so you have this going on. Then finally, one last example of this. Again, this is these individual priests willing to resist this imposition of the official church, I guess, in doing all this stuff. And the man who I'm going to talk about here briefly is Yves Normandin, who is a Quebecois, a French-speaking Catholic priest up in Quebec, in Canada, in Montreal, who, when the Reform came in the early 70s, said Mass and the new Mass like every other, but under the influence of writers like Louis Saint-Laurent and the influence of Marcel Lefeve, which we'll get to in a moment, and others, he went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. While he was on the way there, he actually visited Marcel Lefeve at École, Switzerland, in his seminary. Again, we'll get to him. But in 1975, at his parish in St. Yvette's in Montreal, he decided to start celebrating the Old Mass again, in defiance of his bishop. And I'm mentioning him partly because he has a role to play in this. He spends years, we'll get to this in a moment, doing this. But when the bishop demanded he obey, he invoked canon law against him. And he invoked an article, which it's Article 30 in the old canon law code. I think it's Article 28 in the new one. But it's an article which it's of general norms for canon law, which states that for an immemorial custom to be revoked, to be repealed as law in the church, it has to be explicitly revoked. In other words, you can't insinuate, or you have to be fairly clear about it. And I mention this because, again, you don't have, except for a couple of notes issued by the CDW, you don't have a lot of official stuff coming from the Vatican. And the general idea, and I say this because you don't have to buy this, if you're listening to this, you don't like it, whatever, this is one of their arguments, is that, look, only the Pope has the right to do this, but he has to explicitly say so. And so this is one of the big contentions that traditionalists have. So you can't do that. You have to come out and say, yes, I hereby abrogate it. Which not even Pope Francis was willing to do in his recent motu proprio. He doesn't go that far. He also invoked Yves Normandin against his bishop, Pius V's bull, Quo Primum. Quo Primum was the bull which accompanied his revision of the Roman Missal in 1570, which, if you know anything about this, it's invoked sometimes because he basically grants the right in perpetuity to say this Mass Again, it's a little bit different because popes really can't bind future popes like that, not in that way. So that's not as big of a target. They make that claim sometimes. I don't think it's as strong a claim. I think the canon law claim has a little more to it. But he also pointed out, of course, as we said before, and he's correct, Paul VI's Apostolic Constitution had not explicitly abrogated the old rite. And his bishop was polite with him and not cruel or anything, but he refused to budge, refused to talk to him. And yet Normandy refused to leave his parish while he appealed to Rome. And then so for 6 months, basically, he held out against his bishop. And the cause became a cause célèbre. It got attention internationally because he was sort of, defying his bishop and all this stuff. And the only reason it just didn't work out for him was that the archdiocese kind of tricked him. They called him before a diocesan tribunal in 1975, and so he had to go. And while he was gone, archdiocesan employees went into the church and changed the locks, and so locked him out. And so he wrote a little pamphlet defending himself as well, which in French he called A Priest Out in the Cold, because he began going on the road. He began driving all over Canada, flying sometimes, saying masses during the week, while saying Sunday Mass at a Bavarian brasserie on Sundays in Montreal, a Bavarian cafe, basically, for the next 8 years, doing this on his own. So it's priests like this who keep the Latin Mass alive in this sort of weird underground where they are defying their bishops, but there's still more. I think there's more gray area than people want to admit when they talk about this. Again, some people, when they think of traditionalists, they think of it as just bad people who want to disobey, and I think that's unfair. And again, even if you don't agree with me, you can at least see things are really weird in the 1970s. They're weird now. They were really weird back then. Now, a couple other things to mention before we get to the second half of this, when we talk about the 800-pound gorilla of the traditionalist movement, is that there were two other places in the world in the 1970s, outside of these I guess clandestine, chapels and stuff like this in the West, where you could actually say the Latin Mass, and where it was actually perfectly canonically legal to do so. And one of these is very interesting. Both of these places go through a sort of conciliar time warp because the reforms just don't get implemented there. And one of these places is in Brazil, in the Diocese of Campos. And this goes back to the bishop of the Diocese of Campos, a man named Antonio de Castro Meyer, who was bishop from the 1940s, had been a friend of Plinio Correa de Oliveira. If you remember who this is the founder of Tradition Family Property, this sort of right-wing Catholic social political organization from Brazil. He's friends with him. He's a bishop at the council. He's friends with Marcel Lefeve. He is part of that group of international fathers which opposes the more progressive members of the Second Vatican Council during the council. And so he comes out of that sort of, counter-revolutionary, I guess, conservative milieu in Brazil. And in 1969, if you recall, last time we talked about the Ottaviani intervention, where you had those theologians critiquing the liturgy. He also writes a critique in the liturgy. He actually writes a letter to Paul VI, detailing his problems, which are very similar to the ones that you see in the Ottaviani intervention, and begging him not to implement the new rite. Paul VI, of course, I don't think responds to him. But what happens is he goes back to his diocese, which he's been there for a long time. He has his own seminary. He just decides to ignore it. He refuses to implement the new liturgy. He does allow his priests, there are a handful of them who want to do this, who want to say the new liturgy, they do it. But everybody else basically goes on like nothing happened. And they keep saying the old Mass up until his retirement in 1981. So for an entire decade, it just didn't appear in the Diocese of Campos. And they'll play an interesting role going forward in all this story. Interesting place down in there. So one place ignores the council, down in Brazil. The other place The other place you could actually have this, and this is the only time I'm going to mention anything outside of the Western world in these episodes on the Traditionalist movement. Again, when we talk about the Council, when we talk about things here, I know the Western world better than anything else. The dynamics are different for the interaction of both the New Liturgy and the Second Vatican Council outside the West. With this one exception I have to mention, because the one other place in the world where the reforms were never implemented was, of course, if you kind of figure this out alright, in China, in mainland China. Oh, the ironies of history, because, of course, the Communist Revolution kicked a lot of the Catholics out of the mainland China. You did have the reforms being implemented in the 1970s in Hong Kong, Macau, places like that, where the church had a presence in what you would call Greater China, Chinese societies outside of the mainland. But because there was this, if you don't know what the Cultural Revolution was in the 1960s in China, Chairman Mao had this destructive Cultural Revolution. We went around, smashing stuff up from the old order and all this stuff. It meant that the changes never got implemented in China. And so after he dies in 1976 and Catholics can start to worship again, they have nothing but old liturgical books, and even in their seminaries, they have nothing but old seminary books to form their priests in Latin. So they're still saying the old Latin Mass up until the end of the 1980s in communist China. And in fact, it's only in 1992 when the bishops of China, mainland China, finally decide to implement the reforms of Vatican II. So at least for a little while, this didn't actually take place. So in other words, again, the official line wanted to say, well, the Latin Mass, we abrogated it and it's gone. Neither one of those things were technically true, or at least you could debate them in the 1970s. They hadn't necessarily destroyed it, and it was still a question as to whether or not, A, could the Pope do that? B, had he done that? And do all these other authorities have the right to prevent lay people and priests from having this older liturgy? So that's the first part of this episode. And so up next we're going to talk about, of course, the French side of things, because of course France is the sort of ground zero of the Traditionalist movement, and of course the birthplace of the Society of St. Pius X. So more on that in a moment. So now we come in the last part of this episode to French traditionalism and the foundation of the Society of St. Pius X. The French traditionalist scene in the 1970s was kind of the wild, wild west of traditionalism, for reasons I've already sort of stated. And there was a lot more, there was some anyway elsewhere, but the attitude, as you're going to see, is more combative and more, in some ways, extreme in France than you will see elsewhere for historical reasons I've already gone over. I don't want to go back into it. But the criticism of the liturgy and the council begins almost as soon as the council begins. I'll just go over some of the key figures here till we get to the big player in all this, Marcel Lefeve. But even before the council is over, you have people criticizing it from the more traditional, whatever I call reactionary part of the French church. The first person I'm aware of is someone named Georges de Nantes, or the Abbé de Nantes, a curate, a priest who was a reactionary. He really was a reactionary well before the council, even in political terms. He was ordained in 1948, but actually started writing for an Action Française newspaper in 1949 under a pseudonym. And his reactionary politics and attitude got him kicked out of the Diocese of Paris in 1952 for accusing people of being communist. And also got him turned away from a Carmelite novitiate in 1955. In 1958, he founded his own religious community, the Little Brothers of the Sacred Heart. And yet his opposition to the French government's withdrawal from Algeria in 1962 by the de Gaulle government, of all things, got him confined to a seminary by the French government. So he was a little bit of a radical anyway before all this started. And he began attacking the council in October of 1962 and complaining about the things that it was doing. And a year later, 1963, his bishop ordered him to stop. He went to Rome several times over the next few years, but was finally suspended because of his criticisms in 1966. A year later, he founded a bulletin called the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and 3 years later formed a League of the Catholic Counter-Reformation in 1970, which then began holding conferences and retreats throughout France. And Denant came up with a unique criticism among traditionalists, as far as I'm aware, there are probably others, of Vatican II. He never attacks the legitimacy of the council at all. He says it's a valid council, it's a perfectly legal council. His criticism of it is that its decrees do not use the traditional formula for binding the faithful. That is, if you go back to the Council of Trent or First Vatican Council, when the church wanted to teach clearly something was supposed to be binding on the faithful, they would issue a series of canons, which gave the positive side of the ledger, and then a series of anathemas, basically declaring anybody to be outside the faith if they went against them. And so it was clear what it was teaching. And he says because of this reason, these teachings weren't definitively binding of the council. And therefore, dissent from them did not put one outside the communion of the church. And in fact, what he complained about was Paul VI not using his authority to condemn dissent, basically. And in fact, he condemned him so harshly in such harsh terms, he was censured several times by the CDF for being too harsh with the Holy Father. Though as far as I'm aware, he was never censured, never suspended, never excommunicated, nor were any errors found in his writings. Despite such criticisms, he was also opposed to what he called the schismatic solution to the post-conciliar crisis. And he urged his followers to remain in their parishes. As you'll see, I won't talk about it too much, but he will actually come into conflict with Marcel Lefeve for obvious reasons. But he, as far as I'm aware, dies in communion with the church, as do his followers, even though they're known to be kind of extreme. And the Catholic Counter-Reformation still exists today in France. It was actually, if memory serves, it was actually labeled as a cult by the French government, this organization that he set up. So there you go. Another major figure in this early 1970s is a man named Abbé Quache, who was a parish curate from French Vexin, trained at the French Seminary in Rome. In December of 1964, about the same time Gomard de Pau did this in the United States, Father Quache sent a letter to all the priests of the Diocese of Beauvais, in which he denounced, quote, the modernist invasions in the liturgy and in the faith, unquote. And in fact, he keeps sending this letter to all the priests of the Diocese of Beauvais. Well, it does it two more times anyway, 1965 and 1967. And 1967, he also founds a bulletin called Combat de la Foi, Combat of the Faith, to spread his ideas. The year previous, he comes into conflict with his bishop. He writes an article in a magazine, religious magazine, in which he talks about the new religion, quote unquote. He's claiming at this point that the Vatican II has introduced a new religion, a new liturgy. And the article is rebuked by his bishop, and it's condemned by the Bishops' Conference of France in 1966. 1968, he issues another pamphlet with another priest named Noel Barbara, called Vade Mecum for the Faithful Catholic, which sells several 100,000 copies. That same year, and he's one of the ones to do this, he's the one I think who starts this, he revives the traditional local procession in his parish, I guess according to the older rite or whatever, against his bishop's orders. He ordered him not to do it, he did it anyway. When the bishop ordered him to stop publishing the next year, 1969, the bishop suspended him ab officio from his office as priest. And from there, the Abbé Quache got even more radical. In the early 1970s, he began disrupting masses that he found to be sacrilegious. In 1972, he and some of his followers disrupted a televised mass that was taking place in a cathedral, for example. And in 1973, he went into a church and destroyed a piece of artwork by a contemporary artist because he thought it was sacrilegious. Piece of artwork in a parish church. and was ordered to pay 1,000 francs in damages for this. And it was the Abbé Quash who was also the instigator behind the first few traditionalist pilgrimages to Rome in 1970, 1972, and eventually established one to Lourdes as well. And so he's one of the people that, if you mentioned, I mentioned last time, the Annibale Bonini, the former secretary of the Concilium, complaining about the traditionalist pilgrims in Rome, calling the new Mass heretical and Protestant. Well, that's Abbé Quash. He's saying stuff like that by the early 1970s. He also eventually acquires a house and starts a convent for some Franciscan nuns in 1972. Tries to start a seminary, doesn't work out for a variety of reasons, but he is, again, on that little more extreme fringe we're talking about here with with the French traditionalist movement. And then finally I come to another figure, another colorful figure in this movement, is a very ancient priest in his 80s when this all starts, a man named Father Duco Bourget. Father Duco Bourget was the, I would call it pastor, if you like, of a group of lay faithful who started meeting in 1974 in the basement of a building called the Salle Wagram, 1974, in Paris, because the Diocese of Paris would not allow them to meet anywhere to say the Latin Mass. By this point, of course, the French bishops have tried to forbid it. They've said it's forbidden, you can't do it. He's a retired priest, so that's one of the reasons why he can get away with this. And anyway, he's the sort of leader of what this gets attention in the French media. They come to be called the Wagram rebels, because they're rebelling against the diocese, and they get a lot of sympathy. There's another priest in London who does this, and he gets sympathetic secular coverage from the news media. Makes sense when you think about it in France. The news media, secular media, is kind of anti-clerical, so maybe they thought this was a good idea. I don't know. But anyway, the number of people coming to this mass every week at this basement with Father Duco Bourget started growing, so that by 1977, there, according to one Michael Davies, author of a defense of Marcel Lefeve, about over 8,000 people were showing up every week to this mass. So they were in desperate need of a church, but they could not get the diocesan authorities to talk to them or give them any place to worship. And there are plenty of older churches in the central of Paris where had, a priest and a handful of parishioners, basically empty. So what happens is one day, 1977, in the church near the center of Paris called Saint Nicolas du Chardonnay, the priest there was saying Mass. There's a couple of priests. There's a handful of parishioners. And all of a sudden, the doors open and a stream of people start flowing into the church. And the priest goes up to him and says, well, just these vast number of people. He says, oh, this is wonderful. Oh, welcome. I'm so overjoyed that you've come here. And one of the men who just came into the church says, we'll see how joyful you are in a minute. Because what happens is, as people start streaming in, is three priests show up in procession with a cross. Father Duco Bourget, Abbé Quash, and one other priest are leading a procession of their Wagram rebels into the church. And all of a sudden, the priest of the parish gets dismayed and says, what are you doing? Why have you come here? And the old man, Father Duco Bourget, when I say old man, he's 84 when this happens. And if you ever see a picture of him, he looks just like Saint Jean Vianney, literally a spitting image with the white hair and everything. Anyway, he says to him, why have you come here? Father Duco Bourget says to him, we have come in nomine Domini. And they proceed, several thousand of them, to pour into the church. They take the table altar that's in front of the high altar, they take it and put it in the sacristy, and they start saying a Mass right there at the high altar. And effectively, they chase the priest and the few parishioners of the parish into the sacristy and lock them out. They put people on guard 24 hours a day to keep them out. Within a few days, the parish priest and his handful of parishioners leave the sacristy. and they occupy Saint Nicolas du Chardonnay. And naturally, the diocesan authorities and the parish priests aren't happy about this. They try to get them out. But the police are very leery about trying to throw them out, partly because, well, if you don't know about French life, the military and the gendarmes, the police, are a little more conservative than most people in France. They're loath to do this anyway. There's also a bigger problem that they have, the diocese does. Because in France, if you don't know, a law was passed in 1905 nationalizing all church property. So all the churches in France are officially owned by the government. And so the diocese couldn't just go in there, call the police, have them take it out. It belonged to the government. And in fact, what happens is the parish priest goes back there a couple months after this happens, trying to, they've been talking to the police, and why aren't you doing anything? And they asked for the police chief, and the sergeant on duty told him he's not here right now. He's assisting mass down at Saint Nicolas du Chardonnay. And so a combination of police, sympathy with the people who took over the church, and the weirdness of this, it's this anti-Catholic laicist law that actually works in their favor. No politician in Paris wanted to cause a ruckus by kicking them out. And so they left them there. And so Paul VI tried to intervene with the Bishop of Paris, Bishop Marty. They made an offer. They tried to give them another parish at the other end of north side of Paris, which was dingy, too small. The people rejected it. And long story short, they're still there to this day. The traditionalists who took over are still in charge of Saint Nicolas du Chardonnay, because no politician will touch this with a 10-foot pole in Paris. And so they got away with this because of, ironically, France's modern secularist regime. And in fact, to this day, by the way, not just that church in Paris, but Paris, France, actually has the biggest Latin Mass community, all together, of any city in France. There's several thousand people a week show up for Mass in Paris at places like Saint Nicolas du Chardonnay. And as you can tell, I'm laughing. This is a kind of a funny story. This is a story, by the way, if you familiarize yourself with traditionalist literature, they love telling it for obvious reasons. After having been treated so badly in the 1970s, it's kind of a fun one for them. But it gives you an idea of how crazy. We've already talked about the craziness on the sort of other side of the liturgical world, and we know there are crazy things going on in the theological world. Things are crazy, definitely on the French side of things. In France, on the traditionalist side. And this brings us finally to the major event that happens here, of course. The founding of the Society of St. Pius X. And Archbishop Marcel Lefeve. We need to talk about who he is for a moment to understand how this happens and what happens. Because some people have a misunderstanding, I think, based on false information, but Lefeve was from northern France, was born in a place called, I think it's Tourcoing, I think is how you pronounce it. I apologize if any French listeners are listening to this. I apologize for butchering your gorgeously beautiful language. Please forgive me. Tourcoing, I think it's near the border with Belgium, near the city of Lille. And he came from a deeply, deeply pious family, very old Catholic family in the region. His father was a factory owner who, to get an idea what kind of family this is, during World War II, he risked his life to rescue prisoners of war. World War I. He rescued prisoners of war from German prison camps. And all of his father's children, including Marcel, became, his four siblings became members of religious orders. They all became missionaries. And in fact, this is, as you're going to see, this is what he does for the church for most of his life, actually. Marcel Lefeve. And so he came from, and I also mentioned his father was a factory owner. He was one of these, he was a Catholic, obviously a very pious Catholic. He helped form these sort of Catholic worker associations, I guess. I don't know how to put it exactly, up in northern France. Again, these were supposed to be alternatives to unions because the church didn't like it at that point. They thought they were They generated too much class conflict, but he did things for his workers. He was a very conscientious man. His father, he was not a political person in that regard. And this goes along with his son. He goes to Rome for seminary, and he'll go to the French seminary in Rome, which is one of the most ultramontane in Rome, if you know what that word means. Ultramontane is a term in the 19th century for people who take a really, 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 really exalted view of papal authority. I would say an exaggerated view of papal authority, but that's what this, in this period, good pious Catholics, everything the Pope said was perfect. Not only can he not err in terms of his infallibility, and this is very much ingrained in his mind, by the way, Marcel Lefeve, you can always trust things coming from Rome, because it of course is the guardian tradition. And he always values, even after events of the 1970s and 80s, does Marcel Lefeve, what he calls Romanitas. Again, this idea that Rome is the center of things, and Rome is how you know if it's Roman, it's good. If it's Roman, it's reliable. And in fact, he at the seminary there, and this is sometimes brought up against him as an association, sort of guilt by association. He's very devoted to the seminary director, the original seminary director of that seminary when he gets there, a man named Lefloche. I think his first name's Henry. Lefloche, F-L-O-C-H, who eventually gets dismissed in 1927 because, if you recall, he was a big supporter of Action Française, that political organization that Pius XI condemned. And so, even though Lefloche was ready to submit, he kicked him out. Lefloche was definitely a supporter of Marat. And again, sometimes people will project this onto Lefeve. For the most part, as far as I can tell, he has not much to do with secular politics, really, at any point in his life. His big inspiration, really, are the encyclicals of people like Pius XI, Leo XIII. Lefeve and most of his immediate clerical followers are inspired by things like the social kingship of Christ. They're inspired by bringing a theological view of the world to bear on social and political questions. Not necessarily any purely political organization. And this is something, there's a academic in England, one of the few, there's been almost nothing written on the Traditionalist movement in the Catholic Church by actual academics. One gentleman, a man named Brian Sutlow, wrote a paper a few years ago when the SSPX was having discussions with Rome, with Pope Francis about coming back into full communion. And he interviewed several members, high-ranking members of the SSPX, and they all pretty much said that that's what motivates them. But for the most part, most of them are not necessarily aligned with a political group. I say this because you will get from time to time some SSPX priests, occasionally bishops, doing things with the Front National in France. But there really isn't, for the most part, as I can see, any intrinsic connection between them. Definitely not Lefeve. He is about theology first, second, and third, as far as I can tell. In any event, when he's ordained a priest in the late 1920s, he decides to become a missionary in Africa, and he goes to Africa. And for the next, basically 30 years of his life, for the most part, he'll come back to France for several times for various reasons. He'll spend the next 30 years of his life in what is today places like Gabon and Senegal. And he will be a highly, highly successful missionary. Sometimes this is beside the point, but sometimes people, when they talk about the great growth of the church in the 20th and 21st centuries in Africa, they sometimes attribute this to the Second Vatican Council, but this is totally false. Almost most of the great missionary endeavors took place before the council by people like Marcel Lefeve, and he is known for this. He's known as a great missionary. He founded dioceses, he founded seminaries and schools, he ordained a bunch of bishops in Africa. For a long time there, he was beloved by people in Africa. In 1996, 5 years after his death, the nation of Gabon actually issued a set of commemorative stamps featuring Lefeve, if you can imagine. In fact, according to Father Louis Boyer, was a French priest involved in the Second Vatican Council, wrote in 1978 that it was the efforts of African bishops, many of whom he'd ordained, that later on, when he comes into conflict with Rome, that keep him from being excommunicated initially. The people in Africa are deeply loyal to Marcel Lefeve because of his efforts. And lest you doubt, I don't know who's listening to this, obviously, probably traditionalists, but if you're a conservative Catholic and I know some who call themselves some conservatives who really hate the SSPX and they hate Lefeve, they think of them as being disobedient and all those other things. No one, and I mean no one, even some of his bitterest enemies ever doubted what a devout person of integrity he was. To give you an example, if you recall the last episode, I talked about Archbishop Benelli, the sostituto of the Secretary of State, and how he dumped all over poor Eric de Savanthum in his letter. Well, when they met in 1976, Benelli with de Savanthum and his wife asked about Marcel Lefeve, because at that point their meeting, he'd already been suspended from the priesthood. And Benelli, who, as you know, is no sweetheart, is sort of the archetypal awful functionary, had this to say about Marcel Lefeve after he'd been suspended from the priesthood. This is Archbishop Benelli, quote, I shall retain forever a profound admiration for the man of God, the man of the church, the man of prayer, the giant missionary, which is Monsignor Lefeve, unquote. That's high praise from someone who, trust me, did not like Marcel Lefeve at all, and was part of the reason why he gets in trouble. The point is that he is a kind of a giant of the pre-Vatican II church. And why they respected, genuinely, as far as I can tell from reading his works and everything, a fairly humble guy, self-effacing, meek, all these other sorts of things. In any case, he finally comes back from Africa in the late 1950s, and he's made the Superior General of the Holy Ghost Fathers, this missionary order in Africa. And he goes on, he plays a role in Vatican II. I won't go into this. He's part of that conservative group that winds up pushing back against progressives at the council. And as I mentioned last episodes, initially he was not necessarily opposed, even before the council, but even after it. He was not necessarily, off-put by what it had done. He'd signed all the decrees, basically. And even as late as 1965, he was still thinking the council and the reforms might be a good thing. What happens is that all of a sudden he starts getting, his news from his confreres in places like Africa, places across France, about what's going on. And he's alarmed by all the sort of craziness that is going on. And in fact, in 1966, Cardinal Ottaviani, the head of the CDF, the former head of the CDF, sends a letter to all the bishops of the world talking about errors in the liturgy and errors of theology being spread around. 1966, of course, is the year of the Dutch Catechism, when they published this catechism, which seems to call into question things like the virgin birth and stuff like this. And Archbishop wrote a letter to him, back to him, basically, for the first time, apparently in private, voicing concerns about the council. That basically the council, he's beginning to grow toward a position that the council has done something wrong, that it is basically a cause of some of these things. And his concerns will begin to grow, such that a year later, rather than go through all the reforms of his order, he's still fairly young, by 1967, he decides to resign as Superior General of the Holy Ghost Fathers and retire. His goal is basically to go off in the countryside. He can continue saying Mass in the way he likes and leave all the craziness behind. What happens is he gets approached by some seminarians in 1969, French seminarians who are off-put by what's going on in seminaries across France and the rest of the Western Church. And if you don't know, we'll get to this in a second. We'll talk about it, but things are kind of going crazy. And they ask him to give them formation. And so in 1969, he looks into starting what amounts to a sort of one-year training course for seminarians before they go on to a university. And eventually, they look for a place. They find it in a place called Econ in Switzerland. And it's founded in 1970. Excuse me. This sort of pre-seminary seminary. Eventually, he gets the idea a year later to create a secular institute. You can do this in canon law. He's a bishop, but he didn't have a diocese anymore. He had been a missionary bishop. So he can't do this, canonically speaking, so he can't have his own seminary, but he can't have an institute like this. So he forms in 1970 the Society of St. Pius X. And he begins teaching, he gets teachers from other places, but he begins teaching students. And long story short, you can kind of guess this, being the capable person that he was. You don't be a successful missionary as he was without doing it. Within 4 years, Lefeve had 104 students and 95 seminaries at Econ. Had ordained 12 priests, had founded an order of sisters, they had brothers, lay oblates, and had already branched out into 4 different countries: Switzerland, the UK, the US, and Italy. In other words, it blossomed overnight. By 1974, according to his biographer, 1 in 7 French seminarians, or seminarians from France, were going to Econ. As we're going to see, this is going to be a problem that gets him in trouble. By the end of 1970, and I say this because by the end of 1970, the seminary had already ceased to celebrate the new Mass. Because by this point, Lefeve has gone to think about the liturgy. What he thinks about the council is that, as far as I'm aware, he never denies their validity or called it heretical. But he thinks that the new Mass, I'm quoting here, quote, leads slowly to heresy. He thinks it's too easy to abuse. And so he basically stops doing it altogether by the end of 1970. And so he has this increasing, suspicion of the council. But basically, he's just doing at this point what he has always done. Now, I'll step back here for a second and talk a little bit about what is going on in France around the time all this is going on. And in the late 1970s, when all this broke out, 1978, Father Bourget was a theologian who was influential prior to the council and during the council as a peritus, and was on the liturgical committee that created the new Mass, wrote an article about this whole period, which doesn't exculpate Marcel Lefeve, but puts things from his perspective and talks about what's going on in France. And basically what's going on in France is that the seminaries are all emptying out. Things are collapsing, basically. And I'll read. It's a passage from his article here. It's worth noting. The first thing that seems to have caught his attention, he means Lefeve's, is the nearly instantaneous degradation of French seminaries as well as clergy recruitment and formation. To realize what the situation was, one must remember that a French-born congregation, specialized in that sort of work, had always until then refused the slightest adaptation of its 17th century customs. Furthermore, it would be an understatement to say that the competent Roman authority encouraged it in this. A few years before the council, one of my friends, an English priest who had devoted his life to this work, I'd had the misfortune of publishing some criticisms of the state of affairs in a French clerical journal. The superiors of this congregation denounced him, and the wrath of Rome soon destroyed his career and besmirched his irreproachable character, ultimately confining him to a tiny suburban parish he was never to leave. Yet as soon as the council came to an end, this congregation's seminaries, particularly in France, but elsewhere too, believed that they had to give in at the first sign of revolution. The speed with which they did so is matched only by their former resistance to the slightest reform. Encounters replaced lectures. The most private of devotional lives gave way to political activism without the slightest transition, and the most conformist ritualism gave way to absurd improvisations. I'll pass over more serious things yet, which were to lead to one of the even most liberal prelates of the United States to withdraw his seminarians from this congregation after a detailed investigation with irrefutable findings. In keeping with this example, one must admit that it was soon an impression of a total free-for-all in all of our seminaries. After stifling authoritarianism and a sickening rose-water sort of piety, unbridled demagoguery and total chaos, if not cynical impiety, took over. From that point, French bishops were sent substantial complaints and respectful yet worried, if not justifiably indignant, observations. Then also there appeared, on the part of those whom they had put in charge in this field, 2 types of response which were to increase and multiply in all other fields. Either, quote, the situation is not as critical as you think, unquote, or it will pass, and anyway, nothing can be done about it, unquote. In fact, under pretext of collegiality, the flight of responsibilities had begun, and under pretext of, quote, setting up democratic structures, unquote, little Soviets arose, taking advantage of the authorities' sudden fear of seeming authoritarian to tyrannize the general run of the clergy and faithful behind their back. Thus, Father Boyer on the situation in France. In other words, all hell broke loose. And so nobody was doing anything. And so this is what Marcel Lefeve is responding to. I mention this because his seminary begins to attract attention with all those members coming into it. In particular, the number of French seminarians coming to his seminary from France worried the French episcopate. Partly because their numbers, I think within a couple of years, the number of seminarians they ordained went from like 270 down to 130, I think within 2 years. In other words, their seminaries are being bled dry, and now they're all going over to Marcel Lefeve, who, of course, is very much a traditionalist. The curriculum he teaches at Econ, of course, is very traditional, very conservative. As you can guess, the bishops of France in 1974 are very progressive. So what happens is, and it's not clear exactly what happens, the assumption, I think Boyer assumes this, other people, the defenders of Lefeve assume this, is that the French bishops begin to try to basically seem to be scheming to get rid of him. And what happens is some cardinals, a commission is formed in Rome in 1974 to discuss the Society of St. Pius X. And this commission of 3 cardinals decides that the Society of St. Pius X needs to have an apostolic visitation take place to check out and see whether its curriculum is up to post-conciliar standards and all this stuff. And so the visitation takes place in November of 1974. And what happens there is that the 2 visitors go to the seminary, and what happens is they do a thorough, investigation. They talk to all the seminarians, all the teachers, and Marcel Lefeve. And in the course of this, they manage to shock some of the seminarians there. They shock them by, according to the account of Lefeve, when the seminarians get to talking to these people from Rome, they scandalized by things like, for example, saying to the seminarians that they thought married clergy would be inevitable. They claimed they did not believe in immutable truth. And they apparently also expressed doubts concerning the physical nature of the resurrection. And so what happened, of course, after this is, this of course shocked Lefeve, and it's kind of not terribly clear. He was scandalized by this, but this is my take on this. Apparently, what drew him to do what he did next was his seminarians flipped out. And if you don't know, a lot of people coming to Lefeve were fleeing the insanity of everything else in the church at the time. Some of these guys were really, if you think of Marcel Lefeve as being extreme, trust me, some of his followers were really kind of out, and they were very, I would say, fragile in little ways. And they flipped out. And so to calm them down, he issued a declaration to them. He wrote this up, read it to them. And I'm going to read parts of this because it's important, because this is what gets him in trouble, actually. I'll read the beginning of it. I'll give you a sense of where this is going, because they were so freaked out. But again, remember now where Lefeve's been trained in his mind, the way he talks. Rome is always right. Rome is always trustworthy. Well, here come these two apostolic visitors from Rome talking, heresy to them. So this is the declaration of November 21st, 1974 of Marcel Lefeve. We hold firmly with all our heart and with all our mind to Catholic Rome, guardian of the Catholic faith, and of the traditions necessary to the maintenance of this faith, to the eternal Rome, mistress of wisdom and truth. The whole idea of an eternal Rome, by the way, will be very, very prominent in Marcel Lefeve's thinking. We refuse, on the other hand, and have always refused, to follow the Rome of neo-modernist and neo-Protestant tendencies, which became clearly manifest during the Second Vatican Council and after the Council in all the reforms issued from it. In effect, all these reforms have contributed and continue to contribute to the destruction of the Church, to the ruin of the priesthood, to the abolition of the sacrifice of the Mass and the sacraments, to the disappearance of the religious life, and to a naturalistic and Teilhardian, he means Teilhard de Chardin, education in the universities, in the seminaries, in catechetics, an education deriving from liberalism and Protestantism, which have been condemned many times by the solemn magisterium of the Church. No authority, not even the highest authority in the hierarchy, can compel us to abandon or to diminish our Catholic faith, so clearly expressed and professed by the Church's magisterium for 19 centuries. And I'm going to stop. I'll read one last quotation here, because he goes on in the same vein for the rest of this. But one thing he does say right here, important for the liturgy especially, he says, "It is impossible to profoundly modify the lex orandi, the law of prayer, liturgy, without modifying the lex credendi, the law of belief. To the new Mass there corresponds the new catechism, the new priesthood, the new seminaries, the new universities, the charismatic church, quote-unquote, Pentecostalism, all of them opposed to orthodoxy and the never-changing magisterium." Again, if you're wondering why, sometimes you will hear traditionalists, rad-trads, talk about the new church, the conciliar church, all this stuff, as if it was all these other sorts of things. And that's effectively what he doesn't come out and say that necessarily, but you have to understand what's going on in the 1970s. You have a brand new liturgy, which doesn't look Catholic to people like Lefeve, so different from what preceded it. You have seminaries which have become hotbeds of heresy. That's not his imagination. You have new catechisms being issued by Episcopal conferences, which are full of things that are contrary to the Catholic faith. You have, he says, a new priesthood. All these things, the things he's talking about are absolutely, for the most part, correct. Obviously, I have a different view on the charismatic movement, but that's a different story. You can understand why they freak out. Because to them, the hierarchy, the bishops, they're acting like there is a new church. And so if this is when you have to understand, again, and just remember now, the confusion that reigns in all this. In fact, in October of 1974, before that visitation, Lefeve complained in a talk to one of his talks that, he talked about, quote, a series of conflicting orders, circulars, constitutions, and orchestrated or manipulated pastoral letters. From what authority do they come? From the Holy See? From the Council? From commissions? From Episcopal conferences? We don't really know. It really was, and to this day, by the way, it's not clear who made all the post-conciliar reforms happen. Did the Council direct that? The Pope do that? Is it just the bishops conferences? Is it just, who is, this is that confusing then. And we're not much better today. People are still arguing over, was the liturgical reform that actually happened what the Council wanted? I don't think it is. Others say no, of course. What did the Council mean in its documents? We still fight over that. So that is the confusion into which, again, it's not just Marcel Lefeve. My impression, this is me reading into what his defenders have said about this. It seemed like he was doing this partly for his own sake, but partly to keep his own people on side, because they went to him because they thought he'd be a rock of stability. And so they needed to see him, I guess, standing up to this or something. In any event, this was a private declaration, not intended for publication. Naturally, he gave it to some friends who published it in early 1975. And I should say, even before the end of 1974, the French bishops have already issued a statement saying the old rite is no longer allowed, which is pretty clearly aimed at Econ at that point. So what happens in 1975, this commission meets in early January of 1975 and basically decides that the seminary needs to go at Econ. And what happens is they invite, and what happens next, by the way, is a matter of dispute, because we'll see in a moment. they invite Marcel Lefeve to come to Rome to talk about the seminary, talk about the report that visitors gave to his seminary. Which, by the way, those two visitors, the ones who were spouting quasi-heretical sounding stuff, gave Icone a glowing report. They had almost nothing bad to say about it. And in fact, as you're going to see, that report gets sort of left behind in all this, and they don't. The commission that condemns him never mentions it again. When he gets to Rome in 1975, he immediately starts being interrogated by these cardinals, and effectively they tell him he's on trial for having, and this is the phrase they're going to use against him, is because his declaration is opposed to the council and the Pope. Now, you heard what I read. He does say some harsh things about the council. He doesn't come out and say it's heretical. He doesn't come out and say it's invalid. He doesn't come out and say the liturgy is invalid. What he says is they are tending toward these things. They're becoming a contributor to these things. And he admitted, by the way, that he wrote that in haste and when he was upset. But he tells them in this back and forth, that's basically what I believe. And so they use that declaration as an excuse to basically condemn the society and order it to be dissolved. Now, I mention this because this suppression of the society, his defenders challenge this for a couple of reasons. One is that it's not known. I mean, they tell him that the Pope has set up this commission. They asked for, his canon lawyer asked for documentation to this effect. They never gave it to them because they denied his appeal when he was asking for this. But they told him that Paul VI basically approved of it after the fact, but they never saw any evidence of this. And I say this because I don't know canon law whatsoever. I'm not going to go into this in much detail. There is some hanky-sounding stuff about this. And they claim that this whole thing's canonically illegal. I have no idea. I don't know canon law. It does sound like a setup to me, however, because virtually everybody involved in the Vatican, including Paul VI, over the next couple of years, as there's this back and forth, increasingly public back and forth, in letters, in press conferences and stuff like this, between the Pope and Lefeve, his interlocutors in Rome all use the same language. He's guilty of opposition to the council, opposition to the post-conciliar reforms, and to the will of the Pope. And they cite, of course, his declaration. They never specify what's wrong with the declaration. They don't specify which points are heretical or anything like that. They just say he's opposed to the council, opposed to the Pope, opposed to the reforms. Therefore, the society has to be shut down. Lefeve asked them, said, okay, that's fine. This is my declaration. You can just discipline me, but leave the society alone. No, they said no. That seems pretty clear to me. The whole point of this is that, at least to me, again, I can't say this for a fact, but that's my reading of it. The French bishops were embarrassed by the fact of his success, had ideological differences with him. They're progressives. He's not. And the Secretary of State, Cardinal Viol, was a Frenchman, progressive, was friends with Paul VI. Sounds like they sort of convinced Paul VI that he was just trying to flout his authority. And so they had this back and forth over the next couple of years, which I won't go into this in too much detail, where this is basically where it winds up. Paul VI, for example, sends a letter after Lefeve ordains another round of priests in 1975, rebuking him for rejecting, and I'm quoting here, quote, a council such as the Second Vatican Council, which has no less authority, which in certain respects is even more important than that of Nicaea. And if you're wondering what's going on here, of course, as I've said before, again, the liturgical reforms are Paul VI reforms. Even if you don't agree with me that the council didn't call for anything like this, definitely the suppression of the old mass is not called for by the council. Paul VI totally identifies his papacy with two things, the council and the liturgical reform. That's his council. That's his liturgy. And he takes any criticism of it personally. And what happens is, if you have to, I'll give you some of the rhetoric here in a moment, other rhetoric. Rome puts so much emphasis, I think, because Paul VI wants it this way, on the authority of the council. It sounds like that basically the entire authority of the church depends on the council and the Pope's authority alone. It really is striking, because what Marcel Lefeve's response to this is basically, what am I doing wrong? I'm doing the exact same thing I'd always done before the council. I'm forming priests in the same way I always have. I'm saying the same liturgy. Why are these things? I'm paraphrasing. He says a lot of other things. And he'll become more extreme, by the way, over time. He will. Don't get me wrong. But in essence, his complaint is the same as Gomard de Pauw's. Why is what I was doing before the council now wrong? And in fact, I think this is why he doesn't back down, actually. Because effectively what the people are telling him, and there's not just the French bishops, the Swiss bishops, who are the ones he was actually under the authority of because of Cones in Switzerland, all intimate to him that the problem with him is basically that he's not getting on board with a new order of things. I'll give you one last example, because what happens, the story is pretty short. He finally gets a meeting with Paul VI. I won't go through this in too much detail. This is already too long an episode. But there's this really emotional meeting. They knew each other, by the way. Paul VI and Marcel Lefeve knew each other for years. You can read his account of it online if you can find it, Marcel Lefeve's account, where you can tell they're talking past each other. And it's basically, Marcel Lefeve says at one point to him, why can't we just have this, what he calls experiment of tradition? Why can't, we're all about pluralism today in the post-conciliar church. Why is there no space for tradition here? And Paul VI says the same thing over and over, basically. Nope, the council says so, I say so, you got to do it. You're just being disobedient. And they're both, by the way, very sincere. It's a really moving, in some ways, depressing. It's kind of sad, in a way, sad episode. Because the next year they order him, by the way, to stop ordaining, to shut which but long story short, he refuses. Again, he thinks what he's doing is consonant with the tradition of the church. He doesn't see what's wrong with it. And so in 1976, and this is a thing he increasingly does, he does this on camera. He has news people there. He becomes kind of a television star, does Archbishop Lefeve. He ordains another round of priests in 1976, and it's then that Paul VI actually suspends him officially from the priesthood. Suspends him ad divinis, which is a canonical term, basically saying all of his powers as priests are suspended that same year. And again, just to give you another idea what's going on here again, shortly before the ordinations, Archbishop Benelli sent Lefeve a letter a couple of days before the ordinations. They took place on June 29th, the feast of St. Peter and Paul. And Benelli sent him a letter saying that his priests needed to be formed to be faithful, quote, to the conciliar church. And again, you sometimes hear that phrase bandied about by traditionalists in a really uncharitable way, which is sometimes they get accused of being schismatics. That's not their imagination. People in the 1970s were talking like that in Rome. So again, I'm not excusing anything Marcel Lefeve did. Disobedience is not a virtue. But this whole thing stinks to high heaven, to be honest with you. This whole initial phase here, anyway. I'll wrap this up real quickly. 2 years later, Paul VI dies. John Paul I, I should say, is elected. He dies after 33 days. And then John Paul II is elected in 1978. At that point, Marcel Lefeve is still suspended, and things are in limbo. I'm not going to give too much commentary here, but I'm going to say at this point, if you haven't gotten my read on this, I'm sympathetic to Marcel Lefeve in this situation. Yes, it's wrong to disobey the Pope, but I think the whole thing, basically, I think the whole drive to shut his seminary down was wrong. I think that what happened was Paul VI let basically people who were his friends, people he trusted, convince him that this was a bigger deal than it was. I really do. I just don't know what harm he was doing at his seminary. Again, if they had not called that visitation down, and again, you can say he walked into it. If he'd been more temperate in his language, perhaps. But again, look at it from his perspective. What they basically wanted him to admit was, what you're doing at the seminary is wrong, even though you're just doing things the way you always have done them. And now, again, sometimes in church history, by the way, that happens when the church will define a dogma, which will change things fairly quickly. Before the First Vatican Council in 1970, you could get away with denying the dogma of papal infallibility had not been formally, solemnly declared as a dogma. Immediately after that, it's you're booted out of the church for that. The problem with appealing to the Second Vatican Council for this sort of thing, unfortunately, is that it was not supposed to be a dogmatic council. What new dogmatic teachings did it even, entail? Does it entail any new things? And do those new teachings invalidate everything that went before? Does the new liturgy invalidate the old one? These are the things that the church has never really sorted out. And as you can kind of see, I want to leave you on this note. Again, you can say what you want. You can say Marcel Lefeve deserved his fate. That's fine. I'm telling you what Paul VI did was wrong. Sorry, it's wrong. If you think what he did was bad, he directly disobeyed a pope. That's true. Ask yourself, if Marcel Lefeve had written a book denying the doctrine of papal infallibility, denying the infallibility of the church, do you think that deserve, suspension, excommunication? Okay, if disobeying the Pope in disciplinary matters is reason for suspension, that should be excommunication, right? I bring up that example because it actually happened. In 1970, Hans Küng, sort of star progressive theologian coming out of the Second Vatican Council, published a book called Infallibility, which openly rejected the doctrine of papal infallibility and any infallibility for the church as a whole. He basically denied that the Holy Ghost has guided the church throughout history. Dogmas, by the way, dogma of papal infallibility, promulgated by Vatican I, reaffirmed by Vatican II. Paul VI did nothing to Hans Küng. In fact, when John Paul II gets into the papacy, he will discipline Hans Küng. He'll remove his license to teach Catholic theology. But that's it. He's never suspended. He never changes his views. He's never excommunicated. He works in a Catholic university for the rest of his life. Dies a Catholic in good standing. And this is one of the big complaints of the traditionalists. Why the discrepancy? If there's no new church, if you're not trying to change the doctrines of the church and get rid of the old and replace it with something new, why are you doing things like this? And again, these reformers in the 1970s seemed to treat the new liturgy as if it were sort of the new ritual of a new faith in some ways. Again, they never say that openly. And I have no idea, by the way, what the motivations are of the people involved in this. I don't want to cast aspersions too widely. And in fact, I'm pretty sure, by the way, when I mentioned the French bishops, I'm pretty sure embarrassment is maybe the biggest motive for them. Marcel Lefeve was making them look bad. You know what bishops don't like? Looking bad in public. And trust me, most of the bishops in France at that point were a bunch of time-serving non-entities. And Marcel Lefeve, with his dynamism and his charisma, made them look bad. That's as much, if not more, of a factor than the whole ideological thing. But, not asking you to agree with anything, but you see it from the perspective of Marcel Lefeve and his followers. And look, my perspective as a secular historian is that this is just, in a time when, again, Paul VI, his authority is being flouted everywhere in the church. I'm not, I have some sympathy with Paul VI. I'm not saying he's the worst person ever. I do think he was a terrible pope, by the way, in terms of his governance of the church. He never did anything to try to rein in the progressive side of the ledger. But I can understand why he would be offended by what Marcel Lefeve did. But this, for all the world, looks like a pope who feels like his authority is slipping away from him. He wants to put his foot down. He's afraid of the reaction from the progressive side. Why? Because they're a lot more powerful than the church. They can make his life miserable. Marcel Lefeve can't. In other words, this looks like an act of punching down on a powerless minority. Which, of course, is what, quite frankly, the recent motu proprio looks like to me. Traditionalist custodes. It looks like punching down on a minority in the church to please a faction within the church. I don't know that for a fact, but it's what it looks like to me. And again, let me be clear. When I say simply with Paul VI, the poor man, he was a weak person. I've had my say. You can listen to my talk on Humanae Vitae for my take on his personality. But poor Paul VI died, had a very sad end to his life. Just to finish up here, if you don't know, 1978, he had a former student of his, Paul VI did, named Aldo Moro, was a politician, was head of the Christian Democratic Party in Italy. And Aldo Moro had this grand scheme. He wanted to have this grand alliance between his Christian Democratic Party, which is kind of like a centrist party, with, I guess, Catholic parties in the Italian legislature, Italian parliament. And the communists in Italy didn't like this. And the communists in Italy back in the 1970s were really violent. At least their extreme groups were. And one of these groups was called the Red Brigades, kidnapped Aldo Moro in 1978, murdered him, and then dumped his body on the doorstep of the Christian Democratic Party headquarters in Rome. And this apparently broke Paul VI. He officiated at his funeral in St. Peter's Square, and supposedly, so the story goes, when he was going through the mass, he let out a cry of despair in the middle of it. He was totally broken by this, was Papa Montini, and he died a few months later. I do have sympathy with Paul VI. He was going through a lot. Having said all that, a lot of this post-conciliar chaos, especially with the liturgy, he bears a large share of the responsibility. Again, if he didn't try to start a new liturgy, if he didn't push all these reforms at once in such a quick manner, a lot of the stuff would have never happened. If he had not let himself be persuaded by one side of an issue like this to do this, this wouldn't have happened. He bears some responsibility for this. One last note, one last thing, I'll let you guys go. The irony of all this, when he was suspended in 1976, there was basically only one person in the Curia left defending Marcel Lefeve and urging, according to his biographer, urging him to use the medicine of mercy instead of suspending him. I'm paraphrasing, but because his thinking was this person that if you push him too far, it'll make a break that can't be healed. Of all people, the one person arguing for him not to do this was Annibale Bugnini. Can you imagine? Annibale Bugnini, the great Satan of the Traditionalist movement, intervened on behalf of Marcel Lefeve. And he was correct, by the way. He was correct. By suspending him, he kind of started Lefeve on the path to, creating essentially as a separate church today. Bugnini was right, and I don't know why he did it. I think maybe in the back of his mind, even though they were, again, obviously opposed in a lot of things. Whatever else you can say about Annibale Bugnini, his ideas were terrible. What he did was terrible. I think he genuinely cared about the liturgy, and I think that's probably what's in the back of his mind. That, and because Lefeve, again, even his opponents recognized what kind of person he was. But at the time, again, you invoke the Pope's authority. There's almost no question, and that must have been another thing that made Paul VI hurt by this, is that he, Marcel Lefeve is a traditionalist who's, big into papal authority. Well, why won't you obey them? You should really read the account of their meeting, because they're just talking past each other the whole time. So, in any event, we're going to stop there. We'll pick up next time with the papacy of John Paul II, and we'll talk about the various divisions that will open up in the Traditionalist movement, and of course, you know how this goes, the story. Eventually, the excommunication of Marcel Lefeve and his and some of the people in his movement, along with the establishment of, as we'll see, a space for traditionalists who love the old liturgy in the church, despite all that. So thank you all. Take care. Thanks for listening. Take care and God bless. Look out for the next episode soon.